Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us on today's webinar. I'm Kelly Vick, the host of the program, and it's my pleasure to introduce our subject matter expert, Gerald West, founder of Caricon. Gerald brings over 27 years of ERP security and GRC experience to the industry, including 100 plus global implementations. With more than 25 years on the customer side, including 13 years as a Pathlock client, he now serves as a strategic advisor focused on GRC evolution and customer value realization. Gerald is a renowned thought leader and author who developed the User Intelligence Framework, AI Whispering, and the C6 Maturity Model, dedicated to helping organizations protect and unlock business value. So on today's program, Gerald will address practices to uncover hidden segregation of duties conflicts across connected applications, how to trigger automated success reviews when risks or roles change, enforcing preventative SOD directly within provisioning workflows, how to reduce over-entitlement to accelerate user onboarding, and best practices to ensure compliance with real-time audit-ready reporting. Gerald will run us through the presentation and we'll pause throughout for our poll questions before taking audience questions at the end. We've got 3 polls lined up for you today, and we will open with our first poll now, which asks, what is your biggest IGA challenge today? So listeners, please select one of the 5 options listed below the player, and please make sure your console is not in full screen mode, or you may not be able to see all of those options. And remember, we do require your response in order to issue CPE credits. So we will leave that poll open for a few minutes and while you respond, and let's get started with today's presentation. So Gerald, over to you.
Thanks, Kelly. And good afternoon, good morning to all of you. So today we're going to be covering what's a really important topic. And what I'd like to leave you with is a practical framework for evaluating your IGA capabilities. But before we start, I would love to just set a frame, step back and set the frame. Now, IGA, identity governance and administration, that sits within the broader IT security space. And one of the missions that we're working on with like-minded organizations is how we challenge and transform the paradigm of security as a necessary cost center to security as a business enabler, as a strategic enabler. And one of the things that I always recall is someone making a statement a while back, just asking an audience a question. He said, if you had a sports car and the brakes didn't work very well, how fast would you go? And that struck a chord. That really positioned the role of security and controls within the business context. And if you think about what a business is doing, and imagine a business like a sports car trying to get to a destination, perhaps even in a race, but it's actually racing through a busy city center with pedestrians and traffic lights and other cars and rules and regulations. How fast can it go? The security and controls provides adaptability, provides agility in order to actually navigate that race quickly. So it's about positioning what we do as IT security professionals as part of the mission of the business, not just a blocker to what the business is trying to do. So that's one part of the argument. The other argument is, well, actually, we need to be enabling the business positively. There was an IT director said to me once, Gerald, don't say no, say how. And again, that's part of the whole idea of security as part of the business mission rather than stopping the business mission. So I want you to hold that frame as we get into this presentation. So we're going to talk about the identity security landscape today, what the changes are and what challenges that are posed to us. And then we'll look at how modern IGA addresses this. Then we'll do a little bit of practical focus on how we can implement some of this and get the value. And then we'll touch on some next steps as well. Right, so let's, I think Kelly did a wonderful job of covering my bio, so I don't really have anything else to add to this, so thanks, Kelly. So I will move on to the next slide. which is on identity security landscape. So we're going to dive straight in. So now, what I would say is, let's set the context. What's actually changed in identity security, and why is legacy IGA struggling? So what do buyers, regulators, customers now expect? And this is what we need to look at. So the first thing is, there are a number of new realities emerging. There are an enormous number of applications that are now proliferating across organizations. The average enterprise uses probably over 100 SaaS applications and probably 5+ cloud platforms. And the problem is that legacy IGA would typically integrate probably 10 to 20 new applications per year. So at that rate, comprehensive coverage would probably take decades. Yeah. So that explosion of applications is a challenge. There's also an explosion of identities. And the total identities are expected to grow by over 200% in the next 12 months. And I think it's about 80% of organizations say that better identity management would have been crucial in any incidents that they've had in terms of attacks. This explosion of applications and of identities that inevitably leads to an increased attack surface and the requirement for a more swift response to threats is also part of this threat evolution landscape. I think it's estimated that about 83% of breaches involve compromised credentials. Yeah, and these breaches probably cost an average of almost $5 million per breach. So identity isn't just an IT problem; it's a business risk problem. But the key thing is there are also some new drivers. The traditional driver of IGA projects was, well, we need to be able to evidence to auditors that access was appropriate, etc., and it's very much compliance driven. But what we're seeing is that the IGA market is growing, and there is now a shift. Organizations are adopting IGA based on security and business enablement, risk reduction and business enablement as the adoption drivers. So that's very interesting. Now, having said that, it is worth just noting that there is still an element of shift in this space. So applications, we have inconsistent access models across systems. Each app may use its own roles, permissions, and authentication mechanisms. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge with the applications is that high-risk apps demand disproportionate oversight and effort. So the third thing, if we look at finance applications or HR applications with personal data, these ERP applications, these tend to require far more rigor, deeper reviews, tighter controls, and a lot more effort to manage access safely. And finally, spreadsheets don't scale. These manual processes are challenging. And if a connector isn't available out of the box, you either invest in custom integration work or you end up with fragmented tools and lost visibility. So this explosion of applications is a genuine challenge. If we go through the other points, so explosion of identities that we covered earlier, and if we just step through that, so continuous access verification is becoming overwhelming with the level of identities. Now you're not just looking at human users, you've got service accounts, bots, contractors, machine identities. You've got these quarterly certifications that consume almost 150 person days per cycle, which is quite eye-watering. In terms of the difficulty to maintain accurate identity lifecycle management, we have provisioning, deprovisioning, and role updates become increasingly error-prone. We have a lot of orphan accounts and elevated risk. Especially around deprovisioning can be a problem. If you're relying on manual processes. We also look at the role in policy complexity. This is really challenging. Having more identities means that we have more exceptions, more temporary access, and an increased difficulty defining clean, least privileged access models. But the real challenge, I think, is what's coming. As these non-human identities. So we're talking about, AI agents, these bots and service accounts. These are now operating with privileges that often exceed their human creators, those of their human creators. So most organizations struggle with, identifying how many of these autonomous agents are running, what data they access, what decisions they make. And this is probably the emerging governance challenge for 2026. So, modern IGA must extend to manage these identities as well. And next one was our evolving threats. 91% of organizations experienced at least one identity-related incident in the past year. Identity is often one of the culprits, the key culprit implicated in the majority of breaches, because it's a much easier way. They say that attackers don't break in, they log in, and that's probably true. So identity governance is now a frontline security topic, not just an audit topic. The numbers on detection time are pretty sobering. I mean, if you look at 81 days average to detect and contain an insider risk, and 292 days for breaches involving stolen credentials. So the insider threat reality is particularly stark. If you look at 83% of organizations reported at least one insider attack in the past year. The average annual cost, again, it will be organizationally dependent, but these are fairly significant numbers. Now, the third problem is static roles and infrequent reviews can't really keep pace with these dynamic risk patterns. So this is why the market is moving towards continuous monitoring and risk-aware governance. This is what some analysts refer to as the shift from certification theater to continuous controls. And finally, we talk about the new drivers. Now, this quote from 2025 Gartner Market Guide. It really does capture the strategic shift. While regulatory compliance remains foundational, more organizations are now implementing IGA solutions to support broader security outcomes and business efficiency goals. Now, historically, IGA was driven primarily by compliance, as we mentioned. We needed to prove access was appropriate at audit time, just proving the access appropriate at audit time. Now, adoption is equally driven by security outcomes and business enablement. So the conversation has expanded. IGA is expected to support both governance and operational efficiency. So it's not just a question of will this pass the audit, will this make us more secure, and will this also be more efficient for the business? Now, having said that, I think we should still acknowledge that compliance is still a very strong driving force, and the regulatory pressure is intensifying dramatically. So NIS 2 came into effect in October 2024. This directive requires appropriate security measures with top management liability, significant penalties, The key thing is that you are getting that executive sponsorship, that direct personal accountability, which shifts the focus and makes executives far more interested in IT security than might be a natural posture. And DORA similarly, became effective on 17th of January 2025. And for financial sector organizations, this requires real-time insight into all user rights and regular access reviews. There was an article, I think it's Article 28, I think, specifically mandates these capabilities. So I think incident reporting must occur within 4 hours of classification, and the penalties are probably about 2% of global annual turnover. Plus I think they have daily penalty payments as well. And of course, you still have SOX, which has been around for a while. And I think material weakness announcements typically cause 2 to 5% stock price drops. Access-related material weaknesses increased from 40% to 55%. That was a KPMG 2023 study. So yeah, regulation is still there. Compliance is still a driver, but we will acknowledge that what's happening with organizations is they're beginning to be motivated by their own strategic risk reduction and business outcomes around efficiency. So let's look at some of these business outcomes. So this idea of a tension between, on the one hand, compliance and security pushing for stricter verification, more frequent reviews, tighter controls, effectively slow down and verify. But on the other hand, you've got business enablement and cost reduction is pushing for faster provisioning, less friction, automation to lower operating costs. So the message here is speed up and reduce friction. So on the surface, these goals appear to conflict, but modern IGA is about resolving this tension. It's about using automation and risk intelligence so that you can move fast without losing control, reduce cost without increasing risk. It's that sports car that can get to the destination quickly without running over passengers and crashing into other cars. The organization that gets this right doesn't choose between security and efficiency. It aims to achieve both. And that is the promise of modern IGA, and that's what the 5 capabilities framework aims to deliver. So moving to, that allows us to look at some of the pain that currently is felt. So we want to distill some of these market realities into their operational impact. And what we see is that there are 3 pains that's cut across organizations almost regardless of industry or size, and these are the root causes behind why legacy IGA becomes unsustainable at scale. Now, let's put a few numbers on these pains here. So if we look at pain 1, which is manual, resource-heavy processes leading to errors and delays. So the average manual access request, could take about 5+ business days to fulfill. Automated systems will shrink this down to 30 minutes or less, which is a significant improvement. And the other massive improvement we see is organizations spending, over 15,000 hours annually managing access rights for, every 10,000 employees. That's equivalent to 7 to 8 full-time staff just processing access requests. A lot of organizations would have moved away from that and are automating some of these access request processes. So then we look at pain 2, which is high-risk applications require excessive oversight. So consider SAP. 140,000 transaction codes, which are the screens, access to the screens, and 3,000 plus authorization objects. These are the permissions, the granular permissions. The complexity is staggering. Because each of those authorization objects also have multiple fields, so it gives you a level of complexity that is pretty impressive. Probably only about, I would say, about 10% of organizations confidently maintain business roles. I think, the rest are struggling. It's not quite there. And again, it's because of the pace of change. And 31% of IGA customers are, looking at ways of how they can switch up or, get something that meets their requirements. So the third pain is keeping up with audits and compliance. Now, KPMG's data shows access-related material weaknesses increased. I think it was about 40% to 55% in just 1 year. SOD issues increased from 34% to 40%. So it's sort of moving in the wrong direction, as it were. But that shows that we have a pace of change which we're struggling to keep up with. So when you add regulatory pressure on top of these operational pains, you can understand why organizations are really looking for a fundamentally different approach. So what I'd like to do, before I show you what that solution, the modern IGA, looks like, I would like to share a framework that we use at Caracan to assess where organizations stand. This is called the C6 maturity model for application access governance. So there are 5 levels, and these are familiar maturity levels, from ad hoc to optimized. And what we also do is we map the value streams to the maturity journey. So as you move up the maturity levels, you get increasing value, and this is measurable with metrics and KPIs. Yeah. So if we start at level 1, ad hoc. So this is where you have reactive manual processes, typically no formal policies. We're basically in firefighting mode constantly, just reacting. By level 2, repeatable. Well, now we've got documented procedures and basic tooling. But execution is probably inconsistent. So at these early levels, the primary value stream is effectiveness, risk reduction, effectively. We're moving from chaos to stability, just getting compliant, stopping the bleeding, basically. So it's really about risk reduction in those early levels. At level 3, defined, and this is often a landmark milestone, effectively. We have standardized processes across the organization. We have workflow automation, typically, and SOD checks, and by SOD we mean segregation of duty checks, typically integrated into the provisioning process. And that's what we expect to see by level 3. So if an organization has implemented a reasonably advanced tool, they should very quickly be at least at level 3, is what and if they're using it effectively. So between level 2 and level 3, the second value stream usually emerges. And this is where it's really about efficiency gains. So level 1 to level 2, they've raised the bar of effectiveness. They've reduced their risk, and maybe they're doing it all manually, but they're getting the results and getting compliant and achieving the risk reduction objectives. But by level 3, what they're trying to do is actually do this more efficiently. So efficiency gains starts to take a big chunk of the value stream. And that's where we see the reduction in provisioning time and the reduction in certification effort, real cost savings. There'll probably still be improvements in effectiveness as well, but the bulk of the value is probably coming from efficiency gains. And then by the time we look at level 4, which is managed, we are now looking at metrics-driven, risk-based controls, continuous monitoring, and critically, this level starts to enable business agility. Yeah. And then finally, if we talk about level 5, which is optimized, that's where we enter the realm of predictive analytics, AI-assisted decisions, continuous improvement. At this level, governance starts to become a bit of a competitive advantage. So the key insight, and this is often missed, is that at level 4 and 5, effectively we open up a third value stream alongside risk reduction and efficiency gains. We also start to get that opportunity element. We call it opportunity and business enablement. So this opportunity value stream, is where governance is no longer just about reducing risk or saving money. It actually starts to enable the business in a very strategic way. So, for example, faster mergers and acquisition integration, because you can onboard acquired employees in days, not months. Accelerated partner onboarding, especially if the partners may compete with you in some scenarios, but it's advantageous for the business to have these partners accessing your systems. Reduce time to market for new initiatives, because access isn't a bottleneck anymore. So most organizations typically will be focused on risk reduction, compliance, and efficiency, what we call effectiveness and efficiency. But those that are more advanced will start to unlock opportunity as well. And going back to the frame that I was mentioning at the beginning, where we're trying to shift IT security from being just a necessary cost to being a strategic enabler for the business, this is an important maturity evolution to aspire to. So let's look at what we see with organizations. The reality from what we are seeing in assessments is that most organizations are around level 2 to 3. There are some at level 1, and there are a few that are level 4, very impressive. And I haven't seen many that truly consistently have that level 5, but a lot of them are. So level 2 to 3 is the majority. So we see that consistent pattern, and I call this infrastructure rich, process poor, because organizations invest heavily in technology. They buy the tools, implement the connectors, configure the workflows, but quite often they underinvest in the governance processes that make those tools effective. We go back to the people, process, technology, data. We often go straight to technology because that's what has all the impressive capabilities. But in order to get the value out of technology, you need to manage the upward stream of people and process as well. The result is that risk is partially addressed if you don't have those appropriate processes and people who can execute them. The risk is partially addressed, and yes, you're not firefighting as much. Efficiency is partially captured. Some automation exists, so you are getting some benefits, but typically you won't be touching that opportunity value stream. Usually remains completely untapped. And that's really the real cost of staying at level 2 to 3. So let me show you some of our typical findings. So policies and procedures, often score around 3.2. So well documented on paper. I think documentation is definitely becoming easier, and people are doing that more consistently. We're seeing technology and tooling usually around 2.4. The investments are made. The technology is very capable, but typically not fully leveraged. That's another thing we see, and that's why value realization is such a big theme, is because most of the technology organizations implement, they don't implement to its fullest extent. They don't make the most of the technology, they don't squeeze all the juice out of the technology. Culture and governance, around 1.8, and this is a significant gap. So it's almost at the people stage of the people process technology data paradigm. So that's an area that also needs ownership, often unclear, accountability, maybe a bit diffuse. So I think what level 2 to 3 organizations are missing, as we said, was the opportunity gap. They pass audits, they have reduced some manual effort, they're not capturing the strategic value, they can't support, initiatives like M&A integration, those sorts of things. And that's where level 4 plus makes a difference. So one of the ways of managing this is to have a structured approach to evolving up the levels. If you're at level 1, then the sort of capabilities that you will be looking at are capabilities that will be moving you from level 1 to probably level 2 or 3. You're unlikely to benefit from capabilities that move you to level 4 or 5, because that change evolution requires quite a lot of other factors around people and process. So what we see is that managing that evolution and having the right capability at the right point in the maturity cycle is really important, or rather unlocking that capability. So that's, and the typical path is, we unlock, make sure we get the effectiveness, and that will typically be achieved by level 2. Maybe, it will carry on being improved by level 3, but a big chunk of effectiveness, risk reduction, compliance needs to probably be achieved by level 2 to 3. And then from there, it's around efficiency gaining and then opportunity. Okay, so that's the maturity model. I think we're now ready to look at the poll results. So Kelly, over to you.
Hi, yes, thank you, Gerald. The results are in for our poll. Remember, we asked, what is your biggest IGA challenge today? So listeners, if you have not answered this poll question already, there is still a little time, so you can input your response below the player. So Gerald, it looks like from our responses that have come in, our winner with 29% of the vote is all of the above. And coming in behind that with 24% of the vote, manual, resource heavy access processes. And then right behind that with 23%, keeping up with audits and compliance, 16% managing risk across multiple applications, and then 6% said balancing provisioning speed versus security. So is there anything surprising here to you?
Not really. I think all of those are very legitimate concerns, and the manual resource element is something that's very painful, and I've had a lot of experience of seeing that both on the provisioning side of things, but also on the certifications. I've seen organizations struggle with manual processes. So it does make sense. So that ranking. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Gerald, for your input on that one. And it's time for us to move on quite quickly to our second poll of the day. So our second poll is now active and ready for your responses under the console. The question here is, which capability would have the biggest impact? Again, please select your responses below the player. And while you do that, listeners, Gerald, I will turn things back over to you.
That's great. Thanks, Kelly. Okay. So let's have a look at the modern IGA. What does this modern IGA solution look like? One that's built for today's scale, today's risk, and speed. So there are 3 pillars that modern IGA rests on. And if we get these right, we can resolve that tension between security and efficiency. So the first one is smart automation with human oversight. So modern IGA blends automation where it reduces effort and errors while keeping human approvals where risk demands it. And it's that balance. The goal is not to remove humans, it's to focus human attention where it matters most. The second is access risk insights across every workflow. So the idea here is that risk insight shouldn't be a separate, after the fact activity. It must inform provisioning, it must inform certifications and any other decisions in real time. You want to prevent risk before it's introduced, not discover it during the next quarter's review. And finally, the third is the old auditability and full visibility. Every access change and approval should be captured in complete audit trails. This makes reporting and audits far less painful, and it's what regulators like the DORA specifically require. I have seen teams struggle to collate audit evidence from disparate systems and try and put it together. So this is definitely a pain point which modern IGA addresses. So let's dig into this a little bit more and look at a specific element of this. There is, automation and audit trails. I think that's something that increasingly we're seeing across a number of solutions. Yeah, but where the governance gets more challenging and where I've seen more failures is that fine-grained risk management across multiple applications. So if we look at this table, you've got user, role, permission. These concepts mean completely different things in SAP versus SuccessFactors versus Oracle versus Workday. There is no standardized security structure. Even across applications from the same vendor, you get significant differences in the security architecture around access. Now, traditional IGA operates at what we call the coarse-grained level, so it's users and roles. Application access governance, which is what we sort of drill into, operates at the fine-grained level. We're talking about transaction codes, which are effectively the screens in SAP as an example, authorization objects, field level access, the detailed granular permissions. So this is where this translation problem lives. Traditional IGA certifies that John Smith has the SAP finance role, but it cannot tell you that the role grants the specific transaction codes and authorizations for vendor maintenance and invoice approval. Yeah, a classic violation. That requires fine-grained analysis, and this is where some IGA vendors will differentiate themselves, and Pathlock is a great example of this. The ability to normalize entitlements and analyze risk consistently. So effectively performing a translation exercise across these different access languages, across the different systems. So let's go into the thrust of this presentation, which is the 5 capabilities that separate modern IGA from legacy tools. And this can be used as a framework to evaluate solutions or evaluate capabilities that you're looking at. So the first capability is fine-grained, is the fine-grained cross-application risk insight. So this is about analyzing risk at the permission level across multiple applications, SAP, Oracle, Workday, there are a whole bunch of ERP applications that would be potentially controls relevant. So not just at the role level within a single system. Yeah, so this is a translation problem that we talked about before. I mean, traditional IGA would probably certify, an AD group, SAP, finance users, and modern AG will tell you that, can create vendors in company codes 1,000 and approve invoices over 10K. So that's the level at which modern IGA would be capturing the access. Certifying an Active Directory group doesn't equal certifying an ERP access. If your solution can't make that translation, you are certifying labels, not actual risk. Yeah. So getting to that fine-grained detail is critical, but also being able to do that across multiple applications that are relevant from a risk perspective. So that's the first capability. And in practice, you do this, if you're talking about segregation of duties, for example, you would create a multi-application rule set where you would define the different parts of the risk based on the system. So if you had a segregation of duties conflict that was between two functions, one could be, let's say it's create vendor, and the other might be create an invoice, for example. So you might be creating the vendor in an upstream procurement system like SAP Ariba or Coupa, and you may be then doing, processing the invoice in an SAP S/4HANA system, and you would have a rule set that would effectively define the function of create vendor in the Coupa system, for example, and have the second part of the conflict, which is the other function for the invoice in SAP S/4HANA. So you'd have that granular capture of the functions, which would then define the conflict. So that's capability one. Capability two is the preventative risk checks. So that's, to borrow a term from DevOps, that's shift left. We want to block the risk before provisioning rather than detecting conflicts during certification. That can make a significant amount of difference in the cost and effectiveness of your SOD management process. So you don't want the risk to even enter production. So one aspect is by affecting the request and provision process, which is what we're talking about. But you can also do that by affecting what we call the design and optimize process, which is in your design of your roles. So at the point of creating your roles, you can also build in this SOD, segregation of duty check, a risk analysis, and catch the risk there so that you're really shifting left even more. So that's the second capability. The third capability is what we call usage-driven risk assessment. So this is where we distinguish between assigned, executable, and executed access, because we want to focus priorities on the materialized risk. And in the next slide, we'll use an example of something we call the risk funnel to illustrate this in a bit more detail. But at a very high level, you have an assigned risk, which might just be at the role level. So I have a role for purchase orders, or a role for vendors, let's say, to use my previous example, a role for vendor maintenance, and I have another role for invoice creation or invoice processing. And so in general, if I have those two roles, then I have an assigned risk. However, if it then transpires, when we look a little bit deeper at the content of the roles and the permissions that the roles actually have, is that my access to the vendor maintenance is for organization A, whereas my access to the invoice processing might be organization B, in which case my actual executable access is completely different. I don't have that risk. The executable risk has disappeared. And then, of course, the executed risk is what I've actually done. So even if I had the right access in the right organizations conflicting, you could still look at, well, what have I actually used them? If I've only ever just created vendors, then I haven't actually executed the risk. So from a material perspective, if we were auditing this and we're trying to see whether there is a material impact, that would be the priority sequence. Okay, and then finally, so the next one is the fourth capability is having the unified audit trail. That single repository that captures every access request, approval, provisioning action, and certification. It's what turns audit preparation, from potentially months into weeks. It's something that's I've seen massive game changer is having that unified audit trail. And finally, intelligent automation with human oversight. We already have a level of machine learning that's been around, AI-powered recommendations with human approval for exceptions. What we expect to see is this is a trend that will grow. It's very much machine learning, but we know that there will be more generative AI, getting involved. That's direction of travel. So this is an area that's going to evolve, as we move forward more and more. So at this point, again, I think we're almost ready to pause. And Kelly, I'll hand over to you for
We are. We're ready to pause and take a look at the results for our second poll. So we asked which capability would have the biggest impact for our listeners. Our top response with 35% of the vote is intelligent automation with human oversight. And second place with 26% is preventative risk checks before provisioning. So what do you make of these responses, Gerald?
Yeah, I think automation. I think automation is expected, and again with the prevalence of AI and the benefits and what we're seeing with adoption, this is almost becoming an absolute must. Yeah, in terms of capability, and with the rapid development of these capabilities, it does promise quite a lot of benefits going forward. I think it's worth mentioning that we have attackers, and the negative side, the attack side of defense is leveraging AI at a rapid rate. So it's really important that those who are in the defensive side also start to scale on the AI front. So I expect to see this grow and grow and grow. There are guardrails that need to be put in, because if we have AI agents, for example, we are doing a lot of stuff with AI. We need to govern those AI agents, even though they're acting in our defensive interest. They still need to be governed. And there's also the other challenge around AI explainability. And if as we with machine learning, it's probably easier because these are much more deterministic scenarios. But once you start to move more into generative AI, it becomes a bit more of a black box, and the explainability challenge starts to grow. So yeah, it's fascinating. I'm not entirely surprised. I would have expected this now to be on there. And again, the whole idea of preventative risk checks, it's all about reducing effort. It's much lower effort if you stop. You actually stop the conflict arising than having to deal with it once it's in production. So no, this is in line. It's good.
Great points, Gerald. Thank you. And just like last time, we will roll right into our third poll out of our discussion of our second. So our final poll is open now and ready for listener responses. Remember, you can respond under the console. This last question is, where are you in your IGA journey? So while we wait for listeners to respond to that, I will hand everything back over to you, Gerald.
Okay. Thanks, Kelly. Right. So the next topic for us is to look at how we evaluate an IGA solution, for example. And there are a number of capabilities that we've listed on this scorecard, and we've actually got a version of this scorecard in the resources that you have afterwards. So the risk granularity, I think that's a key one. Because that really gets to the truth, addresses the whole challenge around false positives as well. So I think that's a really key one. The role level versus permission level. The difference between John has the finance role and John can create and approve his own purchase orders. Permission level eliminates those false positives. The cross application SOD, again, if you have a number of controls relevant applications, then this becomes significant. Risk timing is another one I would cite. Post provisioning versus pre-provisioning. Again, this aligns with the finding from the poll. That's one that really would be great. Modern platforms would block the risk before it enters production. Automation level, yeah, I think 20 to 30% versus 60 to 80%. I think this is just going to grow. This is going to be the direction of travel. In fact, I think I heard someone say recently that IGA, it was identity governance and administration is becoming identity governance and automation, because that's really the direction of travel across the board. There are a couple of additional ones we've put in because we're seeing this as a trend emerging. Review cadence is one of these. Again, the quarterly access certifications. I think there's now direction of travel is continuous. Real-time visibility. So that sort of ends what we call that certification theater. Identity coverage. Again, the growth in non-human entities, that's going to be something. We've got all these bots, but also AI agents increasingly with, fairly, chunky access, as we would say, accessing all sorts of applications because they deliver a lot of benefits. But there is also risk, and, there are all sorts of attack vectors now opening up because of AI. So that's really an area that will need attention. So having that element is also important. Let's move on. I will then talk a little bit about the risk funnel. I think I mentioned this earlier, the risk intelligence funnel. I think I have explained it. I think it's quite a key point, is that you've got those three levels. You've got the assigned access, and I think I gave the example, which is effectively the theoretical access, which is functional primarily. You can do A and B in general. I think the executable access is more specific based on the actual permissions you have. So that's where typically there would be a 40 to 60% reduction in the number of violations that you see when you look at the executable access, because the permissions may strip out the false positives, if you like. And then you go down to the third level. So what have you actually done? Have you actually used the functions in that conflicting way? And that then distills the risk down. And so from a remediation or perspective, you would start with the executed access, and that's how you can be more efficient in how you address the actual material risk. And not all solutions will have that rigorous usage-driven risk assessment across the applications that you need them, and so that's one of the things that is worth looking out for as well. Right. So just a point about value, because ultimately it all boils down to this. And the value is in the eye of the beholder, as we say. So there are typically a number of different stakeholders. You've got the CISO or security leader, you've got the head of audit compliance, you've got IT operations, IAM leads, you've got the CFO, finance leaders. And they all have different lenses through which they're evaluating the IGA initiatives. And I think I won't go through, just in the interest of time, I won't go through each of these in detail, but the point I will make is that modern IGA aims to address the requirements of all the stakeholders, because the more of these stakeholders that you're serving, the more likely the business case is to move forward on any of your initiatives around IGA. So next point is just on how to do this. Again, I'll probably go fairly swiftly through this slide. The first month or so would be around visibility. So just having that single pane of glass across the systems, having that risk inventory, SOD conflict detected, aligning your stakeholders. So, that's sort of the starting point. Then you move on month 2 to 3, automation, provisioning workflows, risk-aware certifications active, automated request routing, supporting the first audit cycles. These are the sort of things you do in months 2 to 3, and then that optimization process will be ongoing, and certainly for months 6 plus, role refinement, audit efficiency gains, etc. So that's what we see typically, and it will vary from organization to organization. But typically, the sequence is visibility first, then automation, and then optimization. And I think this is the last one.
This is our last one. The results are in for the last poll question. So remember, this one was, where are you in your IGA journey? 36% of our listeners said that they are just starting to explore options. 26% have a solution, but looking to optimize. 21% said not currently a priority. And then 11% actively evaluating vendors right now. So what do you make of these answers, Gerald?
Yeah, it always surprises me. It shouldn't, but I always expect a lot more organizations would be already far down this road. But then looking at it more widely, there are probably other priorities that take up attention, and maybe there are more point solutions around specific risk management, around finance systems, for example, that will focus the mind, and they may implement specific tooling to deal with specific issues in a particular system rather than the broader IGA piece. So yeah, it sort of makes sense, but it's not necessarily the obvious solution, obvious result I was expecting. But yeah, thinking about it, it does. I can see how that may have landed. Yeah. Okay, so we're on the home straight now. So just to wrap up, there are a few takeaways I just want to finish off with. So the first is legacy. With all the changes that are happening and the way the world is evolving, legacy IGA is now creating audit theater rather than actually really reducing our risk. So having those role level analyses and reactive controls, probably now with the challenges that are being presented, they're now doing more generation of noise rather than providing insight. So that's the first thing. And of course, modern IGA is adding that risk intelligence at every decision point. I think that's a key principle. The fine-grained analysis, the preventative checks, the usage tracking. This transforms compliance into what we would call proactive governance, effectively. The third point is the 5 capabilities. Now, these 5 capabilities can be used as your evaluation framework. Use them to evaluate any solution you're looking at, where you are right now, cross-app risk, shift left controls, usage tracking, unified audit, smart automation. These are the things to look at. The fourth is value is measurable and multi-stakeholder. So you got security, audit, IT ops, and finance all benefit. And the more of them that benefit, the stronger the business case, the more likely it is to get over the line. And then the fifth one is time to value is faster than you think. And your objective is to make it as fast as possible. That then allows you to get that compounding sponsorship. So visibility in weeks, that already delivers value. Automation in months, and optimization is ongoing. The question is not whether to modernize, but just how quickly you can close that gap between where you are and where the governance really needs to be. So with that, just looking at some next steps. So depending on where you are, if you are just exploring, and I think it was 36% of you were exploring, then best thing is just do some evaluation of your current IGA scenarios, scorecards. That's if you're looking at different solutions, use the IGA evaluation scorecard as a mechanism. If you want to get a sense of where you are in your maturity journey, we've got some free assessments. You can do that at our site. We've got the details here, and it gives you a way of having a measured process to see how you evolve, and that's what we are seeing companies benefiting from. And I would also encourage you to have a good look at a modern IGA solution. Just get a demo. Have a play, maybe even have a proof of concept. And Pathlock has a really good example of a modern IGA solution, and you can go to the Pathlock website and you get a good demo of what these solutions look like, but also you can arrange a proper demo and a proof of concept as well. Okay, and on that note, the last slide is just to just illustrate what the capabilities are within application access governance, and Pathlock has a really good portfolio for demonstrating this. So the first process that we look at when we talk about process maturity is something we call analyze and monitor access. And everyone does this in some way, whether you do it manually or whether you use a tool, that happens. Now, the capability that Pathlock have is they call it access risk analysis, and that gives the capability in this space. Another one is on here is role management, and we have a process we call design and optimize access, and role management provides the capability that allows you to evolve that design and optimize access process. Compliant provisioning capability that maps to the process we call request and provision access. And again, by implementing and making the most of the capabilities within compliant provisioning, you can move up that maturity curve in that request and provision access process. Similarly, for certifications, in terms of review and certify access, that process, again, you can move up maturity curve. And finally, the last process is elevate and control. And Pathlock has that elevated access management. And the idea is that you get the value not just by having the capability, but by using the capability to evolve your processes so that you're actually doing the things that make you more effective, efficient, and agile. So with that, I would say thanks for your attention, and let's move to some questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Gerald, for the presentation. Some fantastic insights there. It is time for the audience questions, so we will fit as many of these in as possible in the time that we have remaining. I want to remind listeners, if you have a question, you can use the question tab in your console. We've had a few great ones come in already. For those of you requesting the slides, you can download the PDF version through the attachments. So I am just going to feed a few of these questions to you, Gerald, and we'll go rapid fire to get through them, as many as we can. So let's start with our first question, which is, can you explain the difference between assigned, executable, and executed risk?
Yes. So assigned risk is looking at what users could do based on the role assignments they have. So it's at that sort of at the role level. what users can actually do based on the permissions is what executable relates to. So in the example I gave, a user had access to, maintain a vendor and create an invoice, for example, in general, and that those were the roles they had. But actually, when you looked inside the roles, the organizational scope of the permissions was one organization versus another, so they couldn't actually execute the conflict in practice. So the executable risk was different. And then, of course, executed risk is what they've actually done. So even if they have access to the function, if they haven't executed it, then the risk level is different, and that's where the executed risk is. So being able to, and it's actually in the interest of efficiency and focus, being able to pinpoint the material risk first is really crucial, for organizations.
Excellent. We have had a couple of questions come in asking about cost. Can we go through what's the ROI case here?
So yeah, the ROI. Typically, I would say there are three key streams. Well, when I've done ROI modeling for organizations, it normally comes from three places. So the first is effectively effort, the cost of effort, which is there are things that we have to do, whether it's provisioning or certifications or audit preparation or audit response. There are a whole bunch of things that are cost-based, effort reward. And modern IGA, and you can quantify this and model this very, very precisely, reduces that. So that's one stream for your ROI case here. The second stream we see is what we call risk avoidance. And that is, if you think of what a cost of a breach is, or a cost of a material finding, or any of these, even an audit finding usually has a cost, because then the auditors have to do additional work, and depending on your contract, you'll probably get cost overruns. Yeah. So you can quantify the risk avoidance. You can use the probability and impact. You can calculate unexpected loss, etc., and you can actually quantify that as well. So you've got that people, the people related cost in terms of effort. You've got the risk avoidance or reduction cost. And then the third cost is actually more generally in the external cost that you may have to, whether it's paying for services that you may not need as much of, or indeed paying for other tooling that you can rationalize because of what you have. So that's where we typically see the ROI emerging from. So you may have a lot of stuff you might be doing on premise, which is highly effortful, and now by shifting it into a modern IGA, you may get some benefits from that. But typically, it's going to be efficiency and effectiveness. Sometimes you do get those opportunity costs as well. There was a scenario where there was a business decision that had to be made about whether to host a divested entity on a separate infrastructure versus have it hosted within the existing infrastructure. And it was all based on what level of governance, what level of security could be stood up. And there was an ROI for doing certain things. So there are a number of ways. So you always have effectiveness, efficiency, and opportunity as the three generic value streams.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to try to run through a few more of these. We've got a few questions, so if we can do some quick fires on these. Rafal is asking regarding ML risk scoring, does the engine only look at last login dates, or can it assign a higher risk score based on outlier behavior? So for example, if an account hasn't been used in 90 days and then suddenly starts accessing sensitive data.
Absolutely. That's there are a number of factors that that contribute to the risk for, but behavior is certainly one of them. There will be other data that feeds into the risk scoring as well, including risk assessments that could be fed from, in terms of the access, access risk, critical access, SODs, etc. So yeah, so the behavior, the usage, as well as the standing access will contribute to the risk score.
Excellent. Nancy is asking, how can we assess toxic combinations, SODs, across applications and or access domains for privileged accesses users? Sorry.
I mean, the tooling enables you. So for example, if I understand the question right, so unlike standing access where it's fixed, the challenge with privileged access is that it's temporary, and so it's not always there. And so you're asking, if someone has access to the elevation mechanism to create purchase orders, which would conflict with access they might have to raise invoices, how do you measure that? How do you get sight of that? And the tooling does allow you to, when you're doing your risk assessments, you can choose to include the elevated assignments as well, or exclude them. So you have a level of flexibility in the tooling. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Gerald. We are coming to the end of the session, so we will leave the questions there for now. It was a pleasure to have you on. I know our listeners appreciate all of the content that you shared with us today. Please do take a moment to leave a rating and feedback for today's session. Your feedback helps us improve future events. That is it for us today. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pathlock, without whom this event would not be possible. And of course, thanks again for listening. Please stay tuned for our next event, and we'll see you next time.
That's great. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.